In this video, we're going to go over energy and the cell, okay? Energy really is the ability to do some form of work. And with energy, we've got two main types, well, three. We've got kinetic energy, which is going to be the energy that is actually doing the work, all right? So if you think of a bike moving downhill, that movement is kinetic energy, okay? Then you've got potential energy. So this one is doing work. Potential is the saved energy. So that bike sitting at the top of a hill waiting to roll down would be an example of potential energy. You've got energy there, but it isn't yet being applied to work situation. All right? The other type of energy is going to be heat energy. And heat energy, for our intents and purposes, is a type of kinetic energy. Okay? But it's not a usable source of energy for our cell, all right? It tends to be a byproduct of the transition between potential to kinetic energy. Because in terms of energy, the first law of thermodynamics tells us energy can be transformed from one state to another. So we can go from kinetic to potential, we can go potential to kinetic. That's the first law of thermodynamics, okay? You can't create or destroy energy, okay? You can transform it. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that that movement or that transformation is never 100% efficient. So we always lose some of our energy, and it's not really lost, it just goes into a different form. But the book talks about it being lost as heat, all right? And in terms of chemical reactions and the human body, that's important because that's what generates your body temperature. Those chemical reactions happening within your body, that cellular respiration, is essentially part of the byproduct associated with that is going to be heat. You're going to essentially lose some of the energy as it goes from doing work to saved or saved to doing work is going to be given off as heat. All right? So that's where those all kind of come into play with the human body. Now, what we want to talk about today in terms of energy. Energy, when we're talking about the cell, is going to be in the form of ATP. And I defined this before. Our ATP is our adenosine triphosphate. So we get our ATP here. And that ATP is a chemical molecule. And essentially what we've got in that ATP, we're storing energy in the chemical bonds of that ATP. So what we've got, because we've got triphosphate, that means we have 3 phosphate groups. All right? That phosphate group is going to be attached to something we discussed when we talked about carbohydrates. We've got a ribose, all right? So we've got a sugar associated with ATP. And then what we've got associated with the ATP, or with the ribose, is going to be an adenine, okay? That adenine is one of our 4 base pairs associated with DNA and RNA. So that's why that probably sounds familiar. When you have a base and a sugar, that base and sugar together give us our adenosine. And then here we have our triphosphates. So we've got 3 phosphate groups. And what's unique about ATP is it can go between this form that I've drawn up here, ATP, and another form, ADP. So ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. So what happens, where our energy in ATP is stored, or where the bulk of the energy that the cell accesses is stored, is in the chemical bond between 2 of our phosphate groups. What happens is that ATP can lose a phosphate. The I just means it's a free phosphate. That then becomes ADP. Okay, let me just define that. ADP is our adenosine diphosphate. So ADP, all right. But that ADP can then be recycled with the input of a phosphate group and go back to being ATP, all right? So there's a lot of energy stored in this bond between those 2 phosphate groups. When we cleave that bond, we now go from being adenosine triphosphate to this would be adenosine diphosphate, okay? And that's going to be the main molecule that's going to do the bulk of the work within the cell, all right? And that ATP is going to be generated in the mitochondria. So one of our organelles that we talked about, all right, that mitochondria is the powerhouse of our cell, and the chemical reaction that's happening there in the mitochondria is going to be cellular respiration. Respiration, there we go, okay? So in terms of the cell, that's going to be where the bulk of the energy is going to come from, is going to be from the mitochondria and the ATP generated in there. The ATP that we're talking about, because I know in the previous videos I talked about active transport and needing to put ATP in, okay? This is what I'm talking about putting in. You need this molecule here, the ATP, and what happens in those chemical reactions where you're talking about needing active transport, the ATP, that phosphate group is cleaved, so the energy is released from that bond. That's going to provide the energy for that particular chemical reaction to get something to move against a concentration gradient. The ATP becomes ADP, but then that ADP can be recycled back with a phosphate added in, back to ATP. Okay, so this is kind of a circular reaction that happens. And that's just kind of the basic, kind of a very basic overview of what ATP is. The next video will go into a little more detail as far as how ATP is used and the type of chemical reactions that are going to happen within the cell, because essentially what you're going to have happen within the cell, you're either going to have cellular reactions that require the input of energy or that are going to generate energy. Okay, so they'll either be endogonic or exogonic, based on whether or not they give off energy or whether they consume energy. So that'll be the topic for the next video. If you have any questions, please let me know.